Miller's Hollow had always been a peaceful town. Nestled between rolling hills and endless fields, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and trouble rarely knocked on anyone's door. But that was before the disappearances began. It started with Tommy Sanders, an 8-year-old boy who vanished on his way home from school. His mother, Linda, swore she had only looked away for a moment, just long enough to check the mail. When she turned back, Tommy was gone. The town searched for days, but no trace of the boy was ever found. Then it was Emily Carter, a 10-year-old girl who loved riding her bike in the park. Her father, a local mechanic, found her bicycle abandoned near the swings, the chain still spinning. The town grew uneasy. 2 missing children in 2 months was more than just bad luck. It was the beginning of something much worse. Detective Mark Reynolds had seen many things in his 20 years on the force, but nothing shook him quite like missing children cases. The uncertainty, the helplessness of the families, it weighed on him. When Sheriff Dawson called him into his office that morning, Mark already had a feeling it was about another missing kid. "You heard about the latest one?" Sheriff Dawson asked, rubbing his temples. "Jeremy Phillips. 11 years old. Went missing last night. His mom put him to bed, and when she woke up, he was gone." Mark sighed, his jaw tightening. "That makes 3. And no leads?" "None. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no witnesses." Dawson leaned forward. "Mark, I need you on this. People are scared. They're starting to think we have a predator in town." Mark nodded. He had already been thinking the same thing. 3 children gone without a trace. No ransom notes, no demands. Just, vanished. Later that day, he drove to the Phillips house. The mother, a frail woman with hollow eyes, answered the door. She barely had the strength to speak as she led Mark to Jeremy's room. It looked like any other 11-year-old's room, posters of superheroes, scattered toys, an open book on the nightstand. Nothing seemed out of place. Except for the window. Mark walked over and ran his fingers along the sill. It was unlocked. Outside, fresh snow covered the ground, untouched. If someone had taken Jeremy through this window, there should have been footprints. But there were none. A chill ran down Mark's spine. Something wasn't adding up. Detective Mark Reynolds sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the case files spread across his desk. 3 missing children, all within 2 months. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no witnesses. It was as if they had simply disappeared into thin air. He flipped through the reports again, searching for anything he might have missed. Tommy Sanders disappeared walking home from school. Emily Carter's abandoned bike was found at the park. Jeremy Phillips vanished from his own bed. Different locations, different circumstances. But there had to be a connection. A soft knock on the door broke his concentration. It was Deputy Lisa Monroe, a sharp young officer with a keen eye for details. She carried a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. "Figured you could use this," she said, placing the coffee on his desk. "Thanks," Mark muttered, rubbing his temples. Lisa sat across from him, flipping open the folder. "I went over all 3 cases again. You're right, there's no clear pattern. But I did notice something odd." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "All 3 kids went missing on a Wednesday night. Same time frame, between 7 and 9 p.m. Mark leaned forward. "That's too much to be a coincidence." "Exactly. And there's something else." Lisa pulled out a map of Miller's Hollow, where 3 red dots marked the locations of the disappearances. Each of these spots forms a rough triangle. And guess what's right in the middle of it? Mark studied the map. His stomach twisted when he saw it. "The old train yard," he muttered. The train yard had been abandoned for years. It used to be a major hub for freight trains, but after a fire in the 90s, the company shut it down. Now it was nothing more than rusted tracks and crumbling warehouses, a perfect hiding place. Lisa nodded. It's the only thing that connects these locations. Mark exhaled. Looks like we're taking a trip to the train yard. By nightfall, Mark and Lisa arrived at the abandoned site. A cold wind howled through the empty train cars, making the metal creak. The place smelled of rust and decay, the air thick with dust. They walked carefully, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Mark's gut told him they were on the right track, but something about the place felt wrong. Then Lisa froze. "Mark, look at this." She pointed to the ground. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small red sneaker. A child's sneaker. Mark's pulse quickened. "Bag it. We need to run it through forensics." But as he turned, he saw something move in the shadows. A figure. Watching them. Then, in an instant, it was gone. Mark's grip tightened on his flashlight as he scanned the shadows. The figure was there one moment, gone the next. His instincts screamed at him, someone was watching them. Lisa crouched down, carefully placing the small red sneaker in an evidence bag. "You saw that, right?" she whispered. Mark nodded, stepping forward. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice echoed through the hollow train yard, but there was no reply. Lisa stood up, hand hovering near her holster. "We need to sweep the area." They moved carefully through the abandoned lot, flashlights flickering against rusted train cars and graffiti-stained walls. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of an old storage building, creating an eerie whistling sound. Then, something crunched beneath Mark's boot. He looked down and felt a chill run through him. Candy wrappers. Bright, colorful ones, the kind kids loved. Lisa knelt beside him, picking up one of the wrappers. "These look fresh. Someone's been here recently." Mark's jaw tightened. Or still is. They pushed forward, past an overturned barrel, deeper into the maze of abandoned train cars. Then they saw it, a small, makeshift shelter nestled between two rusting cargo containers. It was made of old wooden pallets, with a tattered blanket serving as a roof. Lisa swallowed hard. No way a homeless person set this up. This is too small. Mark approached carefully, raising his flashlight. Inside, he saw something that made his stomach turn, a small backpack, covered in dirt. He reached in and pulled it out, brushing off the grime. The name stitched on the front made his breath catch. Jeremy Phillips. Lisa exhaled sharply. Jesus. He was here. Mark looked around, scanning the darkness, his pulse racing. Someone had brought these kids here. But where were they now? A sudden sound, soft, almost like a whisper, made them both freeze. Lisa turned her flashlight toward an old maintenance shed a few yards away. The door was slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. Mark exchanged a look with Lisa. Without a word, they drew their weapons and moved in. Mark's hand trembled slightly as he pushed the door open. The hinges let out a long, agonizing creak. Inside, the darkness swallowed their light. The smell of mildew and damp wood filled the air. Then they saw it. A row of small chairs, lined up perfectly in the center of the room. Each one facing a cracked, dust-covered mirror. And on the wall behind them, scrawled in red paint, were two chilling words. "Watching always." Lisa took a shaky step back. "Mark, what the hell is this?" Before he could answer, a noise came from behind them. Soft footsteps. And then, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. Mark's breath hitched as his flashlight flickered, then died completely. Lisa cursed under her breath as her light followed suit, leaving them in pitch black. "Stay close," Mark whispered, gripping his gun tighter. His ears strained for any sound, any hint of movement. Then he heard it. A slow, deliberate creak from the floorboards. Someone, or something, was in the room with them. Lisa's breathing was shallow. "Mark, what do we do?" Mark's mind raced. Their flashlights had gone out at the same time. That wasn't a coincidence. Someone had cut the power, or worse, they had planned this. He reached for his backup flashlight, clicking it on. A dim, wavering beam cut through the darkness, barely illuminating the rows of small chairs. The cracked mirror at the far end reflected the weak light, distorting their figures. But then, Mark's stomach turned. There were 3 figures in the reflection. But only 2 of them were standing in the room. Lisa saw it, too. Her breath caught in her throat. "Mark." Slowly, Mark turned, raising his flashlight toward the empty space behind them. Nothing. Just the cold, damp air of the abandoned shed. But the mirror told a different story. The 3rd figure remained. A tall, thin shape, standing motionless between them. Then, before either of them could react, Lisa's flashlight sputtered back to life, cutting across the room. The 3rd figure was gone. Lisa stumbled back, her voice shaking. What the hell was that? Mark's hands felt clammy around his gun. "I don't know." But they both knew, this was no trick of the light. Someone had been there. And now they were gone. Mark exhaled sharply, pushing the fear aside. He focused on what they did know, the missing children had been here. Jeremy's backpack. The candy wrappers. The cryptic message on the wall. And now, someone was playing with them. Watching them. Lisa's voice was firm, but he could hear the tremor beneath it. "We need to get this evidence back to the station." Mark nodded. "Agreed. But first." A sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps. Heavy. Purposeful. Coming straight toward the shed. Mark raised his gun, stepping in front of Lisa as the footsteps drew closer. A shadow moved past the slats in the door. Then, silence. Mark's pulse pounded. He reached for the door handle, yanked it open. Nothing. Just the empty train yard. Whoever had been there was gone. Lisa swallowed hard. "We need to leave. Now." Mark didn't argue. They hurried back to the car, adrenaline still burning in their veins. As they pulled away, Mark couldn't shake the feeling crawling up his spine. They weren't alone in that train yard. And whoever had been there wouldn't stop watching. The drive back to the station was tense. Lisa sat in the passenger seat, clutching the evidence bag with Jeremy Phillips' backpack inside. Mark kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights tailing them, but the roads were empty. Who the hell was that back there? Lisa finally broke the silence. Mark exhaled, tightening his grip on the wheel. "Someone who doesn't want us poking around." Lisa stared out the window, her fingers drumming anxiously on her knee. "This isn't random, Mark. They knew we'd go there. They were waiting for us." Mark knew she was right. The missing children, the eerie message on the wall, the vanishing figure in the mirror, none of it was a coincidence. Someone was playing a game with them. And it was just beginning. Back at the station, they wasted no time. Mark placed the evidence bag on his desk, pulled on a pair of gloves, and carefully examined Jeremy's backpack. The zipper was partially open, as if it had been rifled through. Lisa leaned over. "Anything inside?" Mark reached in and pulled out a few crumpled homework papers, a broken pencil, and a small flashlight. But then his fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. He pulled it out, a small silver key, attached to a faded red ribbon. Lisa frowned. That doesn't look like a house key. Mark turned it over in his palm. It was old, slightly rusted. More like a storage locker key, he muttered. Lisa grabbed a notepad. There are only a couple places in town with lockers: bus station, the community center, and... She hesitated. Mark met her eyes. The train yard. They stared at the key in silence. We have to go back, don't we? Lisa finally said. Mark nodded grimly. First thing in the morning. But the night wasn't over yet. Just as Mark was locking up the evidence, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A distorted voice whispered through the speaker. You shouldn't have gone there. Mark stiffened. Who is this? A long pause. Then. Turn around. A chill ran down his spine. Slowly, he turned toward the station's front window. A figure stood outside, just beyond the streetlight's reach. Watching. Then, just like at the train yard. It vanished. Mark bolted toward the front door, yanking it open, his gun already in hand. The cold night air hit him like a wall, but the street was empty. No footprints in the thin layer of frost. No signs of movement. Whoever had been watching was gone, again. Lisa rushed out behind him, her own gun drawn. You saw them? Mark nodded, scanning the shadows. They were right there. Lisa cursed under her breath. This guy's toying with us. Mark lowered his weapon, his mind racing. Whoever called him knew they'd been at the train yard. Knew they had Jeremy's backpack. And now they were watching their every move. We need to trace that call, Lisa said, already pulling out her phone. Back inside the station, she worked with the department's tech team to track the number. Mark, meanwhile, laid out everything they had so far: the missing kids, the messages, the key. A puzzle with too many missing pieces. A few minutes later, Lisa returned, shaking her head. The call was routed through a burner phone. No way to trace it. Mark clenched his jaw. So whoever this is, they're smart. Lisa tapped the key on the desk. Which means we need to get ahead of them. First thing in the morning, we check the train yard storage lockers. Mark exhaled sharply. Agreed. But we don't go alone. We need backup. Lisa nodded. I'll get Dawson to send a couple of guys with us. Mark rubbed his temples. He knew sleep wasn't an option tonight. His gut told him they were running out of time. And somewhere out there, 3 missing children were waiting to be found. The next morning, Mark, Lisa, and 2 deputies pulled up to the abandoned train yard. Sunlight did little to make the place feel less eerie. The rusted trains loomed like silent sentinels, and the bitter wind carried a faint metallic smell. Mark held up the key. Let's find out what this unlocks. They moved carefully through the lot until they reached a row of old storage lockers near the maintenance shed. Most were rusted shut. A few had been broken into long ago. But when Mark tried the key on the 4th locker, the lock clicked open. Lisa exchanged a wary glance with him. Moment of truth. Mark took a breath, then pulled the metal door open. Inside was a single cardboard box. Lisa stepped forward, carefully opening it. Her breath caught. Oh, God. Inside the box were children's belongings. A stuffed bear, a school notebook, a pink sneaker. All covered in dust. But what made Mark's blood run cold was the stack of Polaroid photos. He picked one up. It showed a boy, Tommy Sanders, sitting in a dark room, his eyes wide with fear. He flipped through more. Emily Carter. Jeremy Phillips. Each child, photographed, terrified. Lisa covered her mouth. They were kept somewhere. Mark's hands shook as he pulled out the last photo. This one was different. It wasn't of a child. It was of him. A picture of Mark, taken from outside his house. Lisa's voice trembled. "Mark, he's watching you." A sound behind them made them whirl around. Footsteps. Fast. Heavy. Someone was coming. Mark barely had time to register the sound before the footsteps broke into a sprint. "Get down," he shouted. Lisa dove behind a stack of crates as Mark yanked his gun free, spinning toward the approaching figure. A dark shape bolted between the rusted train cars, moving too fast to get a clear shot. The two deputies, Dawson and Carter, rushed forward, weapons drawn. "We got them." Dawson barked. Mark clenched his jaw. "No. But they're close." Lisa emerged from cover, gripping her gun. "We need to move. Now." Mark took one last glance at the Polaroids before shoving them into his pocket. They had evidence. They had proof the missing children had been kept somewhere. But now, the person behind it all knew they knew. And they weren't going to let them walk away. They swept the train yard carefully, moving between the old freight cars and storage units. The place was a maze of rusted metal and decay, perfect for someone to hide. Then, footsteps again. Mark turned just in time to see a shadow dart into an open train car. "There," he barked, taking off after it. Lisa and the deputies followed as Mark climbed up the steps of the train car, his gun raised. He moved inside, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. Dust filled the air, swirling in the dim light. Lisa followed, whispering, "Careful. It could be a trap." Mark knew she was right. He kept his gun steady, moving forward, when a sudden noise to his left. He turned. Too late. Something struck him hard in the ribs. The impact sent him crashing into the side of the train car. His gun clattered to the ground as pain shot through his side. "Mark!" Lisa shouted, raising her weapon. But the attacker was already gone, slipping through the opposite door. Dawson and Carter ran around the outside, but by the time they reached the other side, the figure had disappeared into the train yard. Mark groaned, pushing himself up. "Damn it!" Lisa grabbed his arm. "You okay?" Mark gritted his teeth. "Yeah. But he got away." Lisa's expression darkened. "Not for long." Dawson stepped inside, scanning the area. What the hell was he even doing in here? Mark's eyes swept the train car. Then, he saw something in the corner. A small metal box. Lisa noticed it too. She stepped forward, cautiously opening the lid. Inside was a tape recorder. Mark frowned. "Turn it on." Lisa pressed play. A voice crackled through the speaker, low, distorted. "You're getting too close." Mark's blood ran cold. "Turn back now, or more children will disappear." The recording ended with a long, eerie silence. Lisa's hands clenched into fists. "This bastard thinks he can scare us off." Mark stared at the tape, jaw tight. "He's not scaring us off." He turned to the others, his voice ice cold. "He's making a mistake." The station felt colder than usual when they returned. The tape recorder sat on Mark's desk, its presence looming over them like a warning. Lisa crossed her arms. "He's taunting us. He wants us to know he's watching." Mark stared at the device, replaying the voice in his head. It wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. Whoever this man was, he wasn't afraid of them. Dawson stepped forward. "So what's the plan? We go public with this?" Mark shook his head. "Not yet. If we announce we found these photos, whoever's behind this might go underground. We can't risk them disappearing before we find those kids. Lisa frowned. Then what do we do? Mark exhaled sharply. We keep pushing. We check every storage unit, every abandoned building, every lead. His jaw tightened. And we start with Jeremy Phillips' parents. The Phillips residence was a modest home on the outskirts of town, its yard overgrown with weeds. Mark and Lisa parked out front, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the driveway. Mrs. Phillips answered the door. She was a thin woman with tired eyes, her face pale with grief. "Detectives," she said quietly, stepping aside. "Come in." The living room was cluttered with old photographs and Jeremy's school projects, untouched since his disappearance. The air felt heavy, as if the walls held the weight of loss. Mark cleared his throat. "Mrs. Phillips, we found Jeremy's backpack." Her hands trembled as she gripped the armrest of her chair. "Where?" Mark hesitated. "At the train yard." Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Lisa leaned forward. "Mrs. Phillips, is there anything Jeremy ever mentioned about the train yard? Did he ever go there?" The woman's gaze drifted toward the window. He used to talk about a man." Mark stiffened. "What man?" She swallowed hard. "A man who told stories." Lisa frowned. "Stories?" Mrs. Phillips nodded slowly. "Jeremy said there was a man near the train yard, an old man who would tell kids scary stories." Mark exchanged a glance with Lisa. "Did you ever see this man?" She shook her head. "I thought it was just a game. Jeremy said he called him the Collector." A chill crawled up Mark's spine. Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. "The Collector?" Mrs. Phillips hesitated, then reached for a small box on the coffee table. She pulled out a drawing, one of Jeremy's. Mark took it and felt his breath hitch. It was a sketch of a tall, thin man in a long coat standing beside a train car. And in the shadows behind him, small figures with hollow eyes. Children. Lisa exhaled sharply. "Jesus Christ." Mark turned back to Mrs. Phillips. "Do you know anyone else who's seen this man?" She hesitated. Then, quietly, she said, "Yes." Mark's pulse pounded. She looked up, eyes filled with fear. "My son's best friend, Billy, saw him too." Mark's stomach dropped. Billy Carter. Another missing child. Mark and Lisa left the Phillips house in silence, the weight of Mrs. Phillips' words settling over them like a dark cloud. "The Collector," Lisa finally murmured, gripping the steering wheel. "What the hell kind of name is that?" Mark clenched his jaw. "A name kids give to someone they don't fully understand. Someone who scared them, but they kept going back to." Lisa shook her head. "Why would they go back? Why would Jeremy and Billy keep talking to this guy?" Mark's stomach twisted. "Because he made them feel safe. At first." Lisa glanced at him, eyes dark with realization. "And then he took them." Neither of them spoke for the rest of the drive. Back at the station, Mark spread the case files across his desk. 3 missing kids, Jeremy Phillips, Billy Carter, and Emily Carter. All taken within the last 6 months. Lisa paced behind him. "If this guy has been lurking around the train yard, someone must have seen him." Mark tapped his fingers against the desk. "There's one person who might know something." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Mark exhaled. "Frank Dempsey. Former security guard at the train yard. He worked there for decades before the company shut down operations. If anyone's seen something strange, it's him." Lisa nodded. "Where is he now?" Mark flipped through his notes. "He runs a pawn shop on the east side of town." Lisa grabbed her coat. Then let's pay him a visit. Dempsey's Pawn was a dimly lit shop filled with old furniture, rusty tools, and dusty antiques. A small bell jingled as Mark and Lisa stepped inside. Behind the counter sat Frank Dempsey, an old man with a gray beard and tired eyes. He squinted at them. Cops? Mark nodded, flashing his badge. Detectives Reynolds and Carter. We have some questions about the train yard. Dempsey's expression darkened. Ain't much left of that place. Lisa stepped forward. We're investigating the disappearances of 3 children. We have reason to believe they were taken near the train yard. Dempsey's face twitched. Ain't got nothin' to do with me. Mark narrowed his eyes. Ever hear the name, the Collector? Dempsey's entire body stiffened. Lisa caught the reaction. So you do know something. Dempsey exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. I ain't talked about that in years. Mark leaned in. Tell us. Dempsey hesitated, then muttered, the Collector ain't a myth. He's real. And if you're smart, you'll stop looking for him. Lisa crossed her arms. Why? Because he'll come after us. Dempsey looked up, and for the first time, Mark saw genuine fear in his eyes. He already is. Mark's blood went cold. Dempsey leaned closer, voice barely a whisper. I saw him once. Years ago. Back when the yard was still active. Kids would come around, play near the trains. But some of them, they never left. Lisa frowned. You're saying he's been doing this for years? Dempsey nodded slowly. He waits. Watches. Finds the lonely ones. The ones no one notices right away. Mark's fists clenched. Who is he? Dempsey shook his head. I don't know his name. But I'll tell you this, he don't take kids for ransom. He don't take M for money. Lisa's voice was barely above a whisper. Then why does he take them? Dempsey swallowed hard. Because he likes to collect things. Mark felt his pulse hammering in his ears. Dempsey's hand trembled as he reached under the counter. He pulled out something wrapped in an old cloth and set it on the table. Lisa unwrapped it, and gasped. It was a child's shoe. Small. Pink. Covered in dust. The same one from the box in the storage locker. Mark's hands went ice cold. Where did you get this? He demanded. Dempsey's voice shook. He left it on my doorstep last night. Mark gripped the small, dust-covered shoe, his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't just a warning, it was a taunt. The Collector wanted them to know he was watching. Lisa folded her arms. You're sure it was him? Dempsey exhaled sharply. I don't know who else it'd be. It was just there, right outside my door this morning. No note, no message. He hesitated. But I know what it means. Mark leaned forward. What does it mean, Dempsey? The old man rubbed a hand over his face, his fingers trembling slightly. It means he knows you're close. And he ain't happy about it. Lisa narrowed her eyes. Good. Let him be unhappy. Dempsey let out a bitter chuckle. Lady, you don't get it. This ain't some street thug or serial killer looking to cover his tracks. This guy is different. He doesn't just take kids. He's been doing this for a long time. He's careful. Precise. You think you're hunting him, but he's already hunting you. Mark clenched his jaw. Then tell us what you know. All of it. Dempsey hesitated. His eyes flickered toward the window, as if expecting to see someone standing outside. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I used to work security at the train yard back when it was still operational. Night shifts mostly. It was always a quiet place after dark, too quiet. But every now and then, I'd hear things. He exhaled. Whispers. Footsteps where there shouldn't be any. At first, I thought it was just vagrants sneaking in to sleep in the empty cars. Lisa nodded. And then? Dempsey swallowed hard. Then kids started talking. He shook his head. I'd hear them whispering about some old man who hung around the yard. A storyteller. They called him the collector. Mark exchanged a glance with Lisa. You ever see him? Dempsey hesitated before nodding. Once. Lisa leaned in. Describe him. Dempsey rubbed his hands together, his voice barely above a whisper. Tall. Real thin. Always wore a long coat. But it was his face that stuck with me. His voice shook slightly. Because he was smiling. Mark felt the unease settle deep in his chest. And the kid? The one you saw him with? Dempsey's gaze darkened. He was young. Maybe 8 or 9. The boy was just standing there next to him, staring at me. Like he wanted to say something, but couldn't. He clenched his fists. I shouted, told the man to back away. But he just put a hand on the kid's shoulder and led him into the shadows. Like he belonged to him. Lisa's expression hardened. What did you do? Dempsey let out a humorless laugh. I reported it. Told my supervisor. You know what he said? He shook his head. Mind your own damn business, Dempsey. Mark gritted his teeth. They covered it up. Dempsey nodded. That was years ago. I tried to forget, but when the disappearances started again. I knew. I just knew. He exhaled shakily. And now, after all these years, he's still talking kids. And if you two don't stop. His voice dropped lower. He'll take you too. Mark locked eyes with Lisa. They weren't backing down. They were going to find the collector. And end this nightmare. Mark sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The conversation with Dempsey replayed in his head like a broken record. This isn't a threat, it's a promise. Lisa was in the passenger seat, checking her gun, her face unreadable. He's pushing us, she said. He wants to see if we'll back down. Mark exhaled sharply. Then let's push back. They were parked near the abandoned train yard. It had once been a hub of activity, but now it was just rusted tracks and broken-down freight cars. A perfect hunting ground for a predator like the collector. Lisa adjusted her bulletproof vest. If he's watching us, let's make sure we give him something to see. Mark glanced at her. You ready? She smirked. Always. They stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at their skin. The train yard was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made Mark's instincts scream that something was wrong. Their plan was simple, draw him out. The collector thrived in the shadows, preying on children who wandered too close. But tonight, they weren't prey. They were hunters. Mark led the way through the yard, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The wind howled through the empty train cars, making them groan like dying animals. Lisa pointed at a set of fresh footprints in the dirt. Someone's been here recently. Mark followed her gaze. The prints were small, too small to be an adult's. His chest tightened. A child had been here. Lisa's voice was sharp. We need to move. They followed the tracks deeper into the yard until they stopped near an old maintenance shed. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Mark reached for his gun. He's here. Lisa nodded, drawing her weapon. Let's end this. Mark pushed the door open, his heart hammering. The smell hit him first, stale sweat, rust, and something else, something rotten. Then he saw them. Polaroid pictures covered the walls, hundreds of them. Faces of children, all different ages, staring back at him. Some were smiling. Others looked terrified. Lisa's breath hitched. Oh my God. Mark stepped forward, scanning the photos. Many were old, their edges curled and yellowed. But then he saw something that made his blood run cold. The most recent pictures, they were of him and Lisa. Lisa cursed. He's been watching us the whole time. Mark turned, every instinct screaming get out. But before he could speak, the door slammed shut behind them. And they weren't alone. Mark's hand shook as he aimed his flashlight at the figure, his breath coming in short gasps. The collector stood motionless in the corner of the shed, his smile never wavering, as though he were savoring their fear. Lisa's voice was steady, though her fingers were tight around her gun. You want to talk, or do we just take him down? Mark didn't answer. His mind raced, but his body felt frozen. The walls of the shed seemed to close in, the photographs of the children, their innocent faces, blurring together in his mind. Was it all a lie? Was this man the cause of the disappearances? Or was he just another twisted piece of the puzzle? The collector tilted his head, his smile growing wider. You think you're here to stop me? His voice was raspy, almost mocking. Mark stepped forward, trying to steady his shaking hands. We know what you've done. The collector's smile faltered for a split second before returning with an eerie calm. You have no idea what you've stumbled into. Lisa took a step closer, her voice colder than ever. We're ending this tonight. But the collector's smile never faded. He raised a hand slowly, the pale fingers moving with unnatural precision. Do you really think you can stop me? You think you can save these children? Mark's eyes narrowed. I don't have to save all of them. Just one. The right one. The collector's smile twisted, the air growing heavier with his every word. You think that's what this is about? Saving them? This is bigger than you, than all of you. Without warning, he moved. Faster than Mark had anticipated, he lunged at them, his coat billowing like the wings of some monstrous bird. Mark fired, once, twice, but the bullet seemed to miss, the figure too quick to be caught. Mark and Lisa both scrambled to their feet, backing toward the door. The collector's laugh echoed in the small shed, a deep, sickening sound that seemed to vibrate in Mark's bones. You're already too late, the collector called after them, his voice an echo in the darkness. They've already chosen. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed open. The bright flood of light from outside cut through the shed, revealing two shadowy figures standing at the threshold. Mark didn't recognize them. The figures stepped forward, their faces hidden in shadow, but their eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating malice. The collector's attention snapped toward them, his smile vanishing. No. Not now. Not like this. Mark's instincts screamed to run, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. Lisa was already moving, her gun raised, eyes locked on the figures. The collector hesitated, his gaze flickering between Mark and the new arrivals. Who are you? Mark demanded, his voice shaky but firm. The figures said nothing. But one of them stepped forward, lifting its hand slowly, revealing something that made Mark's stomach lurch, a child's stuffed toy, blood-stained and frayed. The collector's eyes widened. You can't. But it was too late. Before the collector could react, the figures lunged. There was a flash of movement, a sickening crack, and then the shed was silent. The collector was no more. Mark and Lisa stood there, breathing hard, as the figures slowly turned and vanished into the night. The shed was still. The air felt thick with the weight of what had just happened. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of relief. It was over. At least, for now. Mark glanced at Lisa, and they both knew, nothing would ever be the same again. The nightmare was far from over, but they had won this round.